Today on Culture Architects, we have a very special guest. We have Yael Averbuch West with us, and Yael has a pretty amazing and extensive background. So Yael is a soccer pro in every sense of the word. So Yael played as a child. She ended up going to the University of North Carolina. Some of our listeners may remember the interview that I did with the North Carolina coach Anson Dorrance, where they won many, many championships. And during Yael's time there, she was captain of the team. They won 2 national championships when she was there. Her number was retired. She was also National Player of the Year when she was there. She went on to play on the U.S. national team. She played professionally all over the world. She played in the Women's Professional Soccer League. She also has created, she's the CEO and the founder of a training app company for soccer called Techne Futbol. And in addition to all of that, actually, she also was the first president, the founder, and the first head of the Women's Players Association for the Women's Professional Soccer League. And on top of all of that, Yael happens to be the general manager for Gotham FC, the New York, New Jersey team in the Women's Professional League. So if there's anybody that knows anything about soccer and athletics, it's Yael. So Yael, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the podcast.
I'm excited. I feel a little tired listening to what you just shared about my life. Thank you.
You've done a lot, that's for sure. So we, of course, on this podcast talk a lot about culture. And so you have been on so many different teams at so many points in your life. And I'm sure you've seen teams that had fantastic cultures and you've seen teams that had lousy cultures. And I'm curious, so let's just start with what was the team that you were on that had the worst culture that you can think of?
The worst culture.
Yep.
I thought you were going to ask the opposite.
Going to ask it, but next I'm going to ask you the opposite. But let's start with the worst. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would say that I was part of some youth national teams in the lead up to, all of us aspiring to be on the full women's U.S. national team. And some of those teams were competitive in all the wrong ways and was a really unpleasant and isolating and kind of scary place to show up. And we would go to these training camps. So it wasn't a team that, part of the reason the culture probably was difficult was it wasn't a team where you were together day in and day out throughout the year. It was kind of, you'd go to a training camp and a lot of the same people would be at the training camps, but definitely, I have a kind of a dread in my kind of heart when I think of being part of some of those camps. It was pretty unpleasant at times.
And so let's go the opposite end. So all these teams you've been on, you won lots of championships. What was the best culture team you ever won on?
Yeah, the University of North Carolina is the easy answer, and for good reason, I think. And I have thought about this a lot because now in my role where I'm responsible for a young program and creating a culture, I've thought a lot about how much time builds culture. And what I stepped into at UNC in the women's soccer program was such a long-standing culture that had layers and layers built largely on the leadership of Anson Dorrance. But what I have learned a great deal and seen with cultures is not just the leader saying the culture. Like we didn't start off our season there with a presentation from Anson on what is the culture. It was layered into every single thing we did and how we showed up and how we spoke to each other and the expectations and the way we viewed them. And so many, it was just so ingrained in every essence of what mattered and what didn't. I think too, what didn't matter, And so I think about that a lot and how wonderful it was and how we were set up to win and repeat that winning again and again. And that's really, really hard to build. I realize that now, but definitely that culture stands out to me. And there's a good reason that it's in all the books as an outstanding women's soccer culture.
So when you think about how Anson did that and what you've learned about that, I think about when you came in as a high school graduate, and there you are, your first year, your freshman, and you're going to somehow get integrated into this culture. We talk about, in the business setting, we talk about integration. How do you hire people in a company and they come in and somehow they have to figure out what this culture is. So how did Anson do that at North Carolina?
I've thought about this so much and I've tried to think back because it's so interesting you say that, at Gotham, that's exactly what we're trying to create that we don't yet have. We're so new that we don't have, the Gotham way, quote unquote, and where, people come and we say, this is what it means to be here. Here's how you act. Here's how you do things. We are literally creating that as we operate. And I have thought many times back on how did I know, when I showed up at UNC, how did I know how to act or what was important? And I think part of it was that the other players in the program clearly understood and embodied
Mm.
that. So there were very strong leaders from within the team and the seniors at the time, the juniors at the time, who through their actions, you just knew, like if you were a little too slow on the ball, you're going to get slide tackled. If you were not doing what you're supposed to, a teammate's going to hold you accountable. And what I think was really good in the way that I learned the culture at UNC was not really top down. It wasn't
Hmm.
Anson coming in and saying, here, okay, young ladies, here's how you need to do things. It was what I've since learned. I like this term, a self-cleaning culture. Like
Hmm.
we as a team held each other accountable to the way we wanted it to be. And it
Mm-hmm.
was really important because there was such a long history of success. We didn't want to be the ones to screw it up. So
Yes.
because of that, there was a huge onus on the team and the leadership within the player group. If we were not a good team or we didn't have a good culture, it wasn't because of Anson Dorrance and the University of North Carolina. It was because of us. So
Yeah.
there was a lot of onus on the players to create that culture every day, to hold one another accountable. And that's really special. And it's really, really hard to build.
I think about as I hear you say that, I'm thinking of two examples that come to my mind. One is, you probably remember I've talked about the Moorestown women's lacrosse team. I've written about them, and they've gone, I don't know, 20 years where they're always one of the best teams in the country. And I interviewed they've had a couple of coaches there over that 20-year period. Often the coach, and you've probably seen this in youth programs too, the coach is often a former player, so they lived in that. But when I interviewed the coach as a husband and wife who've been coaching for a lot of years, and similar comments about the players that come in learn from the juniors and seniors who then go on and graduate. And there's a standard to be upheld, and people come in, and you don't want to be the one letting it down. But there's a lot of the ownership of it came from the junior and senior players showing the younger players, this is how we do it here. And I think about that even in professional sports. I think about, I'm a big Eagles fan. And our audience may or may not know I'm a season ticket holder for the Eagles. And so I'm at every game. And as Yael and I do this interview, is the day after an Eagles playoff win. So that was a good thing. But anyway, when you read the articles about the Eagles, they talk a lot about their culture there. And I read articles about the veteran players bringing in the younger ones and showing them this is what it looks like to be a professional. I mean, they're coming out of college. They don't really know what it is to be a professional. And these people these senior leaders of the team in a professional setting are showing the others, this is how we do it, and going out of their way to help younger players. I can imagine there could be some teams where veterans look at the young players as upstarts. What are these people, these young people, what do they know? Instead of in a different team, like I look at how the Eagles are, and those players are bringing them under their wing, and they're teaching them, and they're showing them, and they're encouraging them, and showing them this is how we do it on the Eagles. And I was reading an article recently about that as well, and their coach Nick Sirianni talks a lot about connection. And he makes an interesting point, and this may be relevant for Gotham FC too, but he said that in a college program, all the kids are basically in the same stage of life. On a professional sports team, you've got people, they live in different places. They don't all live in a dorm. They live in different places. Some are married, some aren't. Some have kids, some don't. They're very different from each other. And so it's that much more important to find ways to create connection. And what he says is that, and it makes sense to me, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that when people feel really connected, they work harder for each other. Your teammates, I want to go the extra mile for my teammate. And that translates into performance. And I'm sure you've seen that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge part of it. I was listening to a panel recently. We had some NWSL league meetings. They set up a
Mm-hmm.
really great panel, and I can't remember who said it, but someone said they were a renowned college coach, and they said that the freshmen are only as good as the seniors let them be. And I
Mm.
think that is really
Mm-hmm.
true. Is that, and there was a lot of conversation about culture not, being top down. I
Mm-hmm.
think that that is a way you can do it. That sometimes is the way it needs to start. But to your point, the culture is actually for good or for bad. It's what players see every day and they see their teammates doing, and that becomes the culture. And it's not culture isn't always all the good things. The culture is also the things that you don't want in your
Yeah.
environment, but it's the daily interactions and like what it means to be a blank player, blank
Mm-hmm.
employee.
Mm-hmm.
of that place. So definitely we think about that a lot at Gotham, and that's a challenge too. When when your team is changing a lot, in college, for me at least, there's a normal cycle. It was before all the transfer portal and all the things now with
Mm-hmm.
NIL, but your seniors usually had been there for 4 years, the juniors for 3 years, and there's kind of
Mm-hmm.
this formula. So that you have people who have done this at least for a few years. At Gotham, one of the challenges we had last year and even the year before is the team changes, its makeup changes often enough, and that's true at all in NWSL and probably in sports in general, depending on where you are, that there's enough change that when you don't happen to have that group that's been there for a while that are
Mm-hmm.
also the older, more veteran players, it presents a challenge in terms of where is that leadership going to come from.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a conversation we have a lot: is where's our leadership going to come from? Is it the right balance, the right mix of players to have that leadership and that mentorship in a certain way, as to showing the young players, here's how it's done, here's how you do it well, here's what we expect of you.
Mm-hmm.
That's very strong, by the way, on the U.S. women's national team, the player-led culture, because the
Mm-hmm.
coach there changes a little too regularly sometimes, but the players pass along that culture.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thought about the degree to which this is top down versus not. So if we go back to UNC, I mean, I hear what you're saying about, obviously Anson could say whatever he wants, but the players are going to either live it or not, and then they're going to want to have to transfer it. But Anson certainly talked a lot about the core values that he had established. And so it sounds like, at least from his perspective, maybe you have a different, but that there were things that Anson set out to say, this is how we're going to do it at UNC. Now, again, the players have to live that. So where is the balance between the leader, whether it's the coach, owner, GM, whoever it is, saying this is what it's going to be, and the degree to which the players are developing that?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be, something has to be set by the leadership. The players don't just make it
Yes.
on their own, and I think that's always going to be a recipe for some kind of disaster. If you just say, "Hey, hand it over; it's your responsibility." I feel like I'm stealing things from all the wonderful things I've heard over the years. But our
Mm-hmm.
head coach here at Gotham actually said something interesting in a conversation, and I think this is true. I think the leadership needs to build the road, and then the players or whoever's in the culture needs to drive the
Mm-hmm.
cars.
Yep.
And so I do think it is very important. And what Anson Dorrance essentially did was he set up a model where it was clear how you succeed. And how you
Mm-hmm.
succeed is by competing and being the best at what you do against your teammates. And that, in his methodology, is how then you succeed collectively against your opponent. And
Mm-hmm.
that the culture was initially built by the structure he set up of how you train, how you compete, how that gets recorded, how he selects his lineups, how he does his substitutions. So he set the framework for what makes you successful
Mm-hmm.
in his model, what helps you win. And from there, the nuances of what that looks like and what things, when you're really focused on winning and competing, you can't focus on all the things. So some things don't matter. For example, it did not matter to us that we were wearing matching training gear and looked incredibly unified in our appearance at training. What
Mm-hmm.
mattered was what you did and your performance and how hard you went against your teammate in the 1v1s. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think about that a lot of the things that didn't matter. Like at UNC,
Mm.
our locker room was not, people always say, oh, you go to UNC, it's probably the facilities are so nice. No, our locker room was not,
Mm.
it wasn't special. It actually wasn't nice at all. It was very gritty. It was kind of broken down. They have much nicer facilities now, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the core values, and that
Mm-hmm.
you were being evaluated based on how good of a teammate you were, how strong your leadership was, how much you responded to difficult situations with class and empathy and those kind of things. And so, you can only focus on so many things. And I think
Mm.
quite often, um, the stronger the leadership's focus is on the areas that do matter, it kind of dictates to people also what doesn't matter. And I
Right.
think that's really important. You don't have energy to do all of the things ever. No
Mm-hmm.
one has that energy. So it is really important to prioritize what matters in your program, what matters in your company. And that's where I think the leader really sets the
Mm.
foundation and kind of gives everyone the guardrails. And from within that, the people operating day to day need to figure out the way they want to do it.
So when you think about, I know Anson talked about, and you referred to it, there was a set of core values that he had established. I remember him talking about some quotes he had around all of those and things like
Oh,
that.
yes, we had to memorize those.
So were there other teams you've been on where well, let me ask it this way. In most teams that you've been on, let's say at a higher level, U.S. national team, the professional teams that you've been on, do most of those teams have a set of core values or some statements of that type, or is that unusual in professional ranks?
No, I think it's pretty usual. I think the difference is, and what I've noticed is that I kind of have this pet peeve when people have these really standard kind of like BS things they just write
Mm-hmm.
up on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And I even, I struggle when people are like, well, we need to say what our culture is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think there is some aspect of that, but actually what we need to do is like behave what our culture is
Right.
and be honest about what behaviors move us towards or away from those values. So I think, yes, I, I would say that UNC was probably the strongest of any organization I've been part of in terms of a really clear set of core values. It was kind of a joke that we had to memorize these quotes,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a lot of power in those quotes. And through memorizing them, we really did internalize some things that were very important to Anson and his leadership. And I've been other places where that's done to a lesser extent, or where there's
Mm-hmm.
some monogram drawn up or some list of values. But what I would say is, what made them at UNC so powerful and so memorable were one, that it was we had to memorize them, which I actually think now looking back, I like a lot more than when I was stressed by it at the time. I'm like, we're trying to win the game and I have to memorize this thing.
Uh-huh.
But what was really powerful too was that Anson really embodied them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that was something that I greatly respected, because what happened at UNC is that I felt through my time there, I know a lot of other athletes felt this way in their time in the program, felt that there was great meaning behind what we were doing that was broader than just winning some soccer games or individual achievement. By being part of the program, you felt that you were doing something important in life.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really difficult thing to create, to where people feel that there is significant value in what you're doing beyond trying to make the national team or your own individual
Mm-hmm.
goals, because those on any given day could be going sideways, the wrong way, whatever it is. But the values at UNC that were written were linked very clearly to how we behaved and what was expected. And I'd say, whereas it's not abnormal to have those things written out, the way in which they were implemented was much stronger there than a lot of other places I've been and seen them.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't, to be honest, I know they've been other places. I can't remember them from
Uh-huh.
other places because they weren't.
Which suggests there
Yeah,
wasn't that
yeah,
big.
yeah, exactly. But I definitely know they were listed. We had the presentation in preseason where they were said, and like then you never see
Mm-hmm.
them again. You don't talk about them again. They kind of go by the
Mm.
wayside. But Anson was able to implement them into a larger framework in a way that I think was really special.
Hmm. I remember when I was talking to Anson, he talked about a lot that he learned from Dean Smith at UNC. And I also had interviewed Matt Doherty, who had coached at UNC and had played under Dean Smith. And Matt talks reverently about Dean Smith, as does Anson, and what he learned. And one of the things that Matt Doherty talked about playing on the basketball team under Dean Smith, and I want to ask you about these kinds of examples in your career, is we talk a lot at CultureWise about the importance of rituals, and that rituals help us to, in a systematic way, embed the things that are important. I mean, to some degree, the memorization of those things was a ritual. And Matt Doherty talked about that on the UNC basketball team. Dean Smith really wanted to promote teamwork and passing the ball. And there was this ritual that when someone made a good pass, you looked at them and you kind of pointed your finger and you nodded at them. And this was like a way, you're acknowledging the person who made the pass even more than the person who made the basket. And it was just, this is a ritual. It's just, this is what we do here. And I'm curious whether at UNC or other places, were there rituals like that, whether overtly or maybe less obviously, help to ingrain the culture?
Yeah, absolutely. And I recognize now kind of more than I maybe did at the time, which
Mm,
ones I really liked and thought were powerful. Um, I think too, if you don't have the right foundation for them, those things also can become cheesy and go wrong.
yes.
So it's
Yep.
really an
No
art
question.
to get them right. When growing up playing soccer in North Jersey, there's people from all over the world who would play. Like sometimes I couldn't even communicate with the people coming to my practice sessions. They spoke other languages, but there was a strong culture and this comes from a cultural soccer thing, I think, but
Mm-hmm.
it I'm sure applies in other fields, is when certain people would show up. So we had a girls team, an under 18 girls team. So it was all high school ages girls. And we would have men and boys from all around the world come and play. A lot of them were Spanish speaking or come from other cultures. And when they show up, they would go around and shake every person's hand. They'd look them in the eyes and they would show respect. I'm showing up to do this with you. We're about to compete. We're about to train. But hi, how are you today? I'm a human being. You're a human being. We're about to embark on this together. And I really, really like that. And, our coach, we have a Spanish head coach now. And I don't think this is necessarily a Spanish thing or a Spanish speaking country thing, but he goes around, he has a little fist bump with every player and every staff member in the morning. And I think it's still a big group, it's just like takes him a little while. He's going around. It's kind of, you could look at it and you could be like, okay, like it loses its meaning because there's so many people, but it doesn't, because for one moment, whether he pays attention to every single player in training or talks to every single staff member, for one moment, he's made a connection with those people for the day. And that struck me as a really important piece of culture. And it doesn't have to be that gesture, but I have recognized that to be an important thing, especially in sports where it inherently gets competitive and a little weird at some point during the day when you're holding high standards and stuff in any high performance environment. But I think that was an important one. And I'd say that, I keep going back to UNC because that's what I think of, but but also in professional teams I'm on, I think every team develops its own little rituals in different ways and its own identity in little ways. And it might be just a way that people arrive and warm up. It might be, when I played in Sweden, the team had a little ritual of going to this particular coffee shop that was near the stadium on the way to the game. And it provides some comfort and something predictable within a very unpredictable environment.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that like high performing cultures are really unpredictable because that's the whole thing. You're putting yourself out there and you're embracing discomfort. But with that, you need to rebalance with the comforting factors. And I think the rituals are a really big and important part of that.
It's an interesting perspective. And before you said that, I don't think I actually had thought of rituals in that context, that the ability of a ritual to create something very predictable, which gives a sense of comfort in a high performance, unpredictable kind of way or environment. In the running world, your dad may have talked before, I don't know if he's told you about, there's a famous coach in Illinois called Joe Newton, and there was a book called The Long Green Line. It was a team in Illinois that had won, for 50 years, literally. They were one of the best teams in the country, and it was this coach and had this great team. And I remember watching a video of that team once, and they would have 100 people on a cross-country team. And one of the many rituals that Joe Newton, the coach, had, similar to what you were describing with your coach at Gotham, is every single day at every single practice when they finished, he looked every runner in the eye and shook their hand, much as you're describing, this like moment of connection that even if you're the 100th guy on the team, you're important. I'm thinking about you. You're real right now. And I think those kinds of predictable things, whether it's that connection or even just something as predictable as, what you're describing in Sweden, it gives some level of comfort to know something is unchanging here. And I think, as I think about that, and I think about my whole career, I've often said that I think one of the things that great leaders do, whether it's a head coach or a leader of a company, is they do create a somewhat predictable environment. I've often said they make decisions within a philosophical framework. There's a way that we think about things here. And you can rely, if you're a player on my team or you're an employee in my company, that here's how I'm going to approach this. And there's a predictability about that allows you to not worry about that and go focus on stuff you got to focus on, because you're not worried about, is the president or is the coach going to fly off his handle because he's pissed off about something right now and you don't know where he's going to be. If he's predictable, he or she is predictable, and you know what you can expect, it allows you to focus on your stuff and not worry about the rest. And I think that's part of what the rituals do too.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because that's what I think is valuable in the cultures that are outlined. When you have your core values written out, the cultures that are successful, I think, is where the leader and the leaders on the team or within the group or within the company act in accordance with those. And it's comforting to people. Yes. When the actions don't seem to line up or they're erratic or sometimes they do, and who knows what's going to happen the next day, that's very disconcerting. And it actually, I think, can backfire on even writing them down in the first place. It's better maybe sometimes not to. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of does fit together with why I think, this is our puzzle at Gotham right now. It's, yes, we need to document something that's clear where we say, this is how we operate, here's how decisions are being made. But we have to make sure that that is operationalized into everything we do. And that's a really difficult project, especially when your team is already very good and has high expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been thinking about that a lot. Is I've been part of it being done well, but how do you create that? Where do you start? How do you make sure it's being done? And it's really hard.
Yeah. And I think, your point about authenticity is incredibly important. And I see this in the corporate world, and everybody's in the corporate world has experienced those companies like you're describing and some teams that have created their sets of core values, vision statements, mission statements, all that kind of stuff, that 95% of the time are a bunch of BS and don't really mean anything. And I would agree with you. To a certain extent, it's worse to have something that you say and don't live to than to not have it. It would be better just to not have it. But if we're really authentic about it, it's an incredibly powerful thing. So I'm curious, switching gears just a little bit, I want to talk about your experience of the impact of having really good culture. That in the corporate world, we talk about the fact that, at least it's my view and experience, that you could take the same employees, and if you put them in 3 different cultures, those employees will actually perform differently, regardless of whether their talent or experience or skill is, that the culture has that much influence over how they do their daily work. Do you think that's true in the athletic world as well? Like if you took the same players, the same soccer players, and put them on 3 different teams that had 3 different cultures, would those players perform differently?
Absolutely. I think soccer, maybe even compared to other sports, is very much like a growing business in the sense of um, there is, it's so interconnected, and how somebody, like the nuances of performance and how people connect is so important. One individual can't just get it done for the team. Like it
Mm-hmm.
has to be really fluid, it has to be interconnected, and everyone has to be on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe more so than other sports where you can start and stop a lot, or one player can just have a great game and, score a bunch of points. It's really not like that in soccer. So everybody's individual contribution and the way it works together is hugely important to the team's success. And that's the same way it is in a business. It's not as like you can have one great executive, that doesn't make the business successful.
Yeah.
And so I think that what a great culture does is it allows each individual to really understand the kind of the boundaries, the guardrails, and how they can succeed. And the best cultures, in my opinion, everyone is clear on that, and they're clear on like a really ambitious target. And that's what it was at UNC. It's like you knew how to succeed, but also you were never going to feel comfortable. You always had somewhere else you were going to go. And everyone shared that understanding of what everyone else needed to do to succeed as well. And in that, there's a lot of power, because the best cultures, I think, bring out the best in each individual, but then it's
Mm-hmm.
for the collective of the team. And um, I mean, I've said this a lot of times. I really think that there's no soccer player in the women's game who is good enough to outplay a coach who doesn't believe in them or a culture that doesn't support
Mm.
them. And so, yes, you need a certain amount of talent to be able to be an MVP or be able to be, a certain level of performance. But a bad culture or a coach that doesn't believe in you, doesn't set you up for success, can damper that with any player. No player can outplay that.
Mm.
And maybe that's a little unique to soccer because of what I just described, but really, the culture can either propel a team or totally drag it down. And I've been part of really talented teams, and it's like feels impossible. It doesn't click. It's so frustrating. It's going
Mm-hmm.
wrong. And I've been part of teams that are like a little bit more average, but it just works. And it's
Mm-hmm.
some of it is really intentional with the culture, and some is just the right group and mix of people with the right type of leadership in that moment. And something I didn't really think about, but what was said also in this NWSL meetings that was really interesting, I think, is um, the team is different every year. Like regardless of
Yes.
the changes you make on the roster and how many there are, the changes you make to staff, even if the exact same people show up, you have a different team year over year because no person is the same year over year.
Mm.
And I think that is a really interesting way to look at it. And it's a really unique puzzle. So the same culture that worked at one moment in time could need to evolve itself
Mm.
to fit the same group of people, but then it's a different team. So it's so complex, and it's really hard. I think it's really hard to see exactly how it plays out. Sometimes, like I've been part of things that either work or don't work, and it seems kind of ambiguous. But certainly, I have felt personally the power of it being right or not being right, and it is
Mm-hmm.
like it's a difference with feeling like, why did I train so much? It just isn't working versus like you're on top of the world and playing at
Mm.
the best you've ever played. And it could be the difference of like a couple people here and there, a couple statements here and there, tactical switch, like really small details that can make or break it.
Wow. So I'm curious about, as you know, you've had a lot of different roles in the soccer world, from being, you know, a beginning player to being a captain and a senior leader of a team to and seeing lots of teams, and now being a general manager is a whole nother point of view or perspective to look at a team. And so just first question about that is, so how is your view of team dynamics different looking at it from a GM's perspective than when you were a player?
Yeah, I'm learning so much, and if my view is evolving really rapidly, like every few months that goes by, I'm kind of like, oh, I wish I knew then what I see now, and I'm sure I look, 3 months from now, I'll have the same thought. It's such a different perspective because I am the leader of a staff culture and a player team culture. And I never
Mm-hmm.
thought before about staff culture. That just wasn't part of my paradigm because I was playing on a team and there was
Mm-hmm.
a head coach, but it wasn't, there wasn't such a big staff. And so I now see so many layers to it. I see, the group, the mix of players we have, the mix of staff we have in terms of the people they are. I think of the club and where we are at this moment in time. And, we are not a new club, but we're embarking on a new strategy and just how dynamic women's soccer is. So like the playing field is literally changing as we're growing this. And it's professionalizing in ways that weren't part of my vision when we first started. And so it's so multidimensional that I think this is the biggest challenge to my leadership that I have felt by far in terms of
Mm-hmm.
working on a culture that when I came into this job, there was not a culture of winning here. And to create a winning culture and also make it enjoyable and sustainable, those three things together is a really, really tough thing to do. And I took it for granted when I was a player and I showed up in good cultures. I was like, oh, this is great. That's great. We have our core values. We said it. It's so much harder than just listing those things and having, the one leader. So I think that's the key is like, yeah, we could win, but do people enjoy it? And can we keep winning? Or we
Mm-hmm.
could make this really sustainable thing, but are we going to win, which everyone wants to do?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, we could have a lot of fun, but be like bad at all the rest of the stuff. And so the trifecta of those is really important. And I think joy and humor and that feeling value is so important to making something sustainable. So for us, the way I see it at Gotham is we had a little bit of success, but we want to be sustainably successful. And I am really challenged as a leader to figure out how to do that. And it's different than any time I was a captain of a team,
Mm-hmm.
anything else I've been part of. This is really different, and the stakes are much higher, and there's a lot of attention on us in ways that this is new to me. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm I've seen it done well. I've seen it done not well, but putting that all together and making it unique to us is really,
Mm-hmm.
really challenging.
I was going to ask about, so as you as you take on that challenge, are there models that you can look at of where you think it's been done really well at a professional level? Because college is a different environment, good or bad, just it's different. On a professional level, it's a whole nother thing. Where's the model of where it's done well?
Yeah, I think it's not so much a model. I have taken pieces of different
Okay.
places I've been that I would like to implement here, and they stick out in my mind as like I think, the difference between what matters and what doesn't matter is really important to me. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what people wear to work. Like that to
Mm-hmm.
me is not important. Maybe the culture will evolve here and that does become important and we find value in that. But right now, that to me doesn't matter. But like, and this is something I always think of you with, but like responsiveness
Mm-hmm.
does really matter to me. And that's something that I just think throughout, it's a way you show people respect. And I don't, like winning is really important to me. I think that not every professional sports team, surprisingly to me, now I've learned, really, really cares about winning. We really care about winning here. And I think that is important and that should be the driving factor in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
decisions. So there's things that I'd say like these pillars of or belief systems that I've taken from other places I've
Mm-hmm.
been that really matter to me. I think another important thing that people kind of say, but sometimes don't do is that there are things that are more important than soccer. Like we're human beings. And I think the human component of really at the end of the day, things matter. Like missing a family member's wedding or missing a loved one's funeral, like those things are not no game and no practice session, nothing we're doing here as a soccer club is more important than those things. And that's something that Anson really taught me, is there was always
Mm,
something greater and a human element to it. And so there's certain things that just are like, I don't have the full model because this is just a different project than I've ever been part of. But I have these things that come out in the way I lead and the way I want us to do things. And still, even, my leadership team here at Gotham has taught me a lot of things about culture, about
mhm,
this. So I'm adding to it all the time. And I have kind of this mini arsenal of these core beliefs that I have that are evolving and that I'm adding to. But
mhm.
but I'd say like the difficult thing is that there's not a model. I wish
Yeah.
there was, because that would be
Mhm.
much easier to do.
Well, I would suspect, just from what you're describing in my own experience, and I think about what I would suspect Anson would say on this topic, is that probably for him, it took a number of years of having things like you're describing, where you have some feelings, some thoughts, some belief systems of these are things I think are really important. But I don't know really how to blend all of that together into a coherent picture that says, these are the 10 things. There's pieces of this and pieces of that. And I would imagine Anson would probably say that over his first 5 or 10 years, I'm not sure it always evolved, but especially, I'm guessing in his first 5 or 10 years, they evolved a lot and then reached a place where they coalesced into some clear vision that always had tiny tweaks, but became, this is how I look at the world. And I suspect, I mean, if I think of my own leadership career, I think it probably happened that way, that when I created our first set of fundamentals, some of them were things I just thought about for years and had always taught and talked about, but had never codified in any particular way. And over time, it evolved into a clearer picture in my mind of, this is the kind of company I want to run. And it may not be the right for everybody, but this is my vision of how I think we do things really well. But I think it takes some time for that to evolve. And it sounds to me like you're working your way through picking up the pieces of what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds very true to where I am on my journey. And I do think it takes time. And I think that's part of why, yeah, we need to do some things to clarify at Gotham and to start to lay the groundwork. But I don't believe in coming in with where we are as a club and where I am as a leader and saying, boom, this is the fully fleshed thing. Here's how we do it. Like, realistically, the teams that we have and the staff that we have here from a couple years ago through the next however many years is going to be really integral to creating that. And
Mm-hmm.
probably never again will the groups that are here be so influential in what becomes the club culture. So it is a unique time and it is really a building stage. But yeah, I'm slowly pulling things and piecing together.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that part. I think that's one of the most exciting parts about being a leader is these are none of them are like values that I've made up. They're not proprietary
Yeah.
concepts, but to be able to choose the ones that are important to you, that have given meaning to your own life and journey, and to kind of galvanize a group of people surrounding those. I love that
Yeah.
process. I'm definitely still learning. I can't say I've done a great job of it here so far, but it really, I'm about to do like a staff kickoff presentation on Wednesday. And,
Mm.
and then, we'll have our players arrive and you get this one moment in time for the year to say, here's who we are. Here's where we're coming from. Here's where we're going. Here's what matters. And it's a moment to really riff. I've thought a lot about creating these presentations and what is the most important thing for me to say, because everyone's
Mm-hmm.
nervous and there are a million things going on. So what are they going to take? If they take like two things from this, what could they be? So it's really a fun project, but a work in progress that I do expect will take some years, to your point.
So as you think about recruiting players, and in the corporate world, obviously that's hiring, but you're hiring too, both staff and players. How do you? I mean, there's a lot of things you got to balance. Obviously, trying to bring in certain players are going to play in a certain way and fit in the scheme you have from a purely athletic standpoint. Um, but how do you try to figure out who would be a good fit in the culture that you want to have at Gotham?
I'm learning a lot about the questions to ask and the things for me that are red flags or green flags. I don't know if that's actually a term to be
Mm-hmm.
used. Um, And so, one thing that I think is really important is to say very honestly who we are and who we're not,
Mm.
and hear people react to that. And also, one of the first things we do is I do a little intro whenever I have a recruiting conversation. And then the first thing we do, it's usually me and the coach, maybe a member of ownership. And after we introduce ourselves, we ask the player to tell us about themselves and to tell us what their priorities are and what's most important to them. And I've
Mm.
started to realize there are certain things that they say that either will make them a good fit or not. And for
Mm.
example, if a player is focused on, I mean, usually they wouldn't say this to us because we're in New Jersey, but if they want an easy life and to live in a nice weather climate and they want it to be glamorous and flashy and their playing time, and if they're the center of attention is the most important thing to them. And there are ways they say that that's not
Right.
like that, but you can just
Right.
tell, then we're not for them. And neither, probably New York isn't for anybody who wants that kind of lifestyle in their field, probably. But if somebody is really focused on getting better, even the top players in the world, and they want a coach who's going to, on our, our coach gives pretty blunt feedback on our recruiting meetings to the point where sometimes I'm kind of like, "Ooh, okay, that's like a little harsh. It's one of the best players in the world. Like, do I have to say this?" But actually seeing how they react it, the players who will do well at Gotham love that. They are so excited. I get a message from the agent after the fact saying, that was the most she learned in however long. She's so excited to play for Juan, our coach. And the players who kind of don't love that or are offended or maybe didn't want that, they're not right for us because we have a very competitive team. Nobody just gets handed their playing time. We're in New Jersey. It's going to be snowy. It's going to be rainy. It's going to be whatever it is. And their, core to them has to be the willingness to fight to improve regardless where they are. So culturally at its like most basic level, that is probably the best test. And, when we talk to a player, if the agent is sending me messages worried about their playing time and seeing we're signing other players and how does this affect my player and that kind of stuff, it's usually like not really going to be good. And because at some point they're not going to play. And then, and that happens to everyone, but if that is like their worst nightmare in the world, then we have a problem. If their worst nightmare in the world is not getting better this year, then we could work with that.
Right.
And so for us, that's like that is the key element of our culture that I think we screen by. I would love to evolve to the point where when we have really clear values and behaviors that we want, where we actually do more of a psychological assessment and maybe give someone like a personality test or something within the rule. There's some, we got to be careful of the rules with that stuff, but some type of assessment where we can actually gauge, how are they going to respond to our coaching in our environment? So there's room for us to evolve this for sure, but we are pretty sensitive to, it has to be a two-way fit. We can look at any player and say, we want you, but how are they actually going to do and like it? Where they feel proud to be here? Or are they going to be like, I'd kind of rather be in San Diego or something easier?
Yeah. I think about the NFL. Of course, it's legendary for in the draft process, the things they put people through. And I suspect, I haven't seen the research on this, but I just suspect that some of them do it really well and some don't. Because they sometimes bring in players that doesn't seem like a good fit at all, but they at least are trying to be pretty purposeful in pre-draft. They do the combine and all other stuff, and beyond the physical stuff, it seems like there's been a significant expansion in the psychological testing and the emotional testing and getting to understand who is this person at their core, and we don't want to bring this player in if they're not going to be the kind of people we want in our culture.
Yeah, and the amount of investment going into those choices is so incredible. Our ownership group now is part owners of the Giants, or owns half the Giants. So I have gotten a little bit of a taste of like the type of things they're considering, and it's really smart and it's really aspirational for us to try to get to the point where we have all those considerations as well. Because it's true, it's like, what type of family support does someone have? What's going to happen when they have a bad day at Gotham at training? Who are they going home and talking to? And what impact is that going to have on how they show up the next day? Those things are make or break in somebody's career. Yet most times we just go in blind. We don't know. We don't know what happens from the time they're at the field till we see them again. We don't really know. So I think the more you know about that, the more you can predict somebody's, longevity as a pro, somebody's ceiling as a pro. It's really hard to tell those things just based on scouting or data.
In going back to the Eagles for a moment, that Coach Sirianni talks a lot about what they think a player's ceiling might be and which players are most likely to get to their ceiling. And they talk a lot about, this person, this guy, because of his attitude, his work ethic, his desire to be great, maybe his ceiling might not be as high as somebody else, but he's more likely to get to his ceiling because of all those psychological attributes that person brings to the table. And they're looking for players that are more likely to get to their ceiling because of those attributes.
Yeah, and then you have a happier player too if they know they're maximizing their potential versus they could be more talented but falling short and always feeling disappointed, and that feeling manifests in the culture. Like that's really, I think, people's feelings about what they do every day, even if they don't talk about it. When you show up and you're down and you're depressed, or you show up and you're overjoyed to be living your dream, like those things really make a difference. So they can be subtle, but they can be really impactful too.
Yeah. So as you think back to when you were a player and you and your, if you had an agent, and your agent were looking at teams for you to go to as a player, were you as aware of those cultural things then, or were you clueless about those things, or what do you know now about that?
Oh, I knew nothing about that. I wasn't thinking about that. I also would say that the majority of pro clubs I played for didn't have any culture, or everyone were so new, or the
Hmm.
culture wasn't good, but you were picking between it was a little bad or a lot bad. Like it was the type of emphasis on this, these were not professionalized organizations in
Mm.
terms of what we're trying to do at Gotham. There was like 5, 6 staff members maybe, and a group of players, and that would change all the time, and nobody was talking about this.
Hmm.
So this had, I probably could have really benefited from a lot more of a look in terms of how the head coach was, acting and what type of leader they were and all those things. But it was just not even a consideration at
Hmm.
all.
Wow. And so I mean, you're bringing a level of professionalism to Gotham that has not been seen in the Women's Professional League before. Are other teams stepping up that degree of professionalism as well, or is that sort of unique to Gotham?
It's not unique to us. I don't want to
Mm.
pretend by any means that we're
Mm.
leading the way in this.
Mm.
We are all in some ways reacting to a really rapidly changing landscape and
Mm.
professionalism of the game. And there are clubs like the women's clubs worldwide who are leading the way are all tied to historic men's clubs. So like
Okay.
FC Barcelona women, the Chelsea Arsenal women, they are linked to a long-standing culture that is it is not their women's team culture. It is the club culture. And here's how it is. And it's through their academy, their women's program, their men's. The project we have is unique here in the US because we have a number of clubs who are not linked to men's clubs and some who
Okay.
are. But we are all embarking on this kind of new world of professionalization and rapid growth in terms of what this looks like and what the vision is for it. And so we're in a unique place in navigating it here at Gotham based on our history and where we're going, but everywhere is kind of on the same path. And some are a little
Mm.
ahead in one area and behind in others. So for us, it's also how do we find competitive differentiation
Mm.
in the market as we do this? This is really important for us to be a top winning club and make the brand we want, the on-field results we want. This is crucial, but we're not alone in leading the way and professionalizing what we're doing. That's kind of the current landscape, and everyone is being
Hmm.
pushed to do that by the game itself is dictating that. The CBA is dictating that. Other things are dictating that outside of us just being proactive and wanting to.
Hmm. And I'm assuming that the league is growing from a attendance and advertising standpoint and business standpoint as well.
Yeah, all of it is, the what ceilings are being shattered. Like
Mm.
what we thought was possible and how we saw things and what we thought of, women's soccer facilities and all this looks like in so many ways. Like the bar is totally raised beyond what I ever imagined, at least as a player.
Wow.
So yeah, it's really the business of it is growing significantly, which also means it matters more. What we're doing, more people are watching it. There's more emphasis on winning, and that sells tickets and all these things.
Hmm.
So it all really is this kind of interesting swell, and it feeds off of it all feeds off of each other.
And you certainly have a unique, I would think somewhat unique perspective on having played and been on teams at so many different ways. Are other general managers among the other teams, are they typically former players, or is that pretty unusual?
So it was very unusual when I started this,
Hmm.
and now there are a number of other former players. I actually don't know the current stats. Maybe
Hmm.
there was at some point. I think there were 6
Oh,
of
wow.
14 teams were former players, but we all also come from other backgrounds. Like there's a former player who has a military and legal background also. And then
Hmm.
there are former players who have done other things in between this and being a GM. And so um, I think that is no longer a differentiator, but our ability to use all of our experiences alongside that, I think really can be a differentiator. So
Hmm.
that's no longer unique, but it definitely provides both a benefit, but also I would say in some ways it has my vision of this is only as grand as what I experienced, which, as I kind of alluded to, wasn't great. So I
Hmm.
think it also in some ways is a bit of a, we have to intentionally expand our horizons and think beyond what we experience as players ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love your description of the three things that you said you're trying to build in the culture of Gotham, being a winning culture, being a sustainable culture, and making sure that we're having fun at that. And it certainly sounds like a sort of a good three-pronged pyramid, for lack of a better word, for building the foundation of that culture. So my last question for you is, I'm always curious about, for anybody, whether it's me, you, or anybody else, over the years, you've gained a lot of insight and wisdom that you talked about things that you didn't realize then you see in such a different way today. And I'm always curious, like if you were talking to the 16-year-old Yael, that player that she was and the person that she was, and here you are as a wiser, older, granted, lots more to lots more to grow and lots more to learn, goes without saying, but you learned an awful lot. You have just a whole different perspective than you would have had at that time. What advice would you give, or what wisdom would you share with that 16-year-old Yael that from what you see today?
Yeah, I don't know if I would have listened to my advice as a 16-year-old, but yeah, I think there's two things I would have done differently if I'm looking back. One is
Mm-hmm.
I would have found a mental performance coach or a sports psychologist
Hmm.
to guide me in terms of managing the type of stress I was under. Now that's really it's very talked about. It's very normal. Like I had a
Mm.
lot of performance anxiety. I had a lot of stress surrounding my expectations and the ever existing gap between
Mm.
where I was and where I wanted to be. And I really could have used professional help on that and consistent help. Like I needed, as diligent as I was about my training, I wish I was as diligent about the mental side of the game.
Hmm.
And I knew it was important, but I didn't really internalize how important that was.
Interesting.
I think the other thing is I would have benefited from being in more supportive cultures. Like I realize now about myself that I thrive when people believe in me. I want to prove people
Hmm.
right about myself. I don't do well proving people wrong. Like I just
Hmm.
not does not motivating for me to prove someone wrong who doesn't believe in me. And I was in a lot of environments where I was proving the coach wrong or I was trying to overcome some odds.
Hmm.
It's not me. It's just not how I thrive. It's not how I do well. But if someone believes in me, I will go to the ends of the earth. I will do everything. I will
Hmm.
continue to raise their expectations of me and meet them. And I did not play for enough coaches or enough environments where that was how I was looked at. So I think I had this understanding that to get better, you needed to go outside your comfort zone and be pushed. I think at a certain point, that was no longer what I needed. And I
Hmm.
waited far too long to kind of course correct on that. So I guess I don't know if that's really advice, but I guess
Yeah.
those two things, I needed a softer approach at some point and a more forgiving environment
Mm-hmm.
and a more forgiving support for myself that I would have gone back and told myself to try to, I think my advice would be like, you'll actually be better if you ease up a little on those type
Mm-hmm.
of beliefs.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have listened, but I would try.
It's fascinating, and you know, I think back to our comments about some people will be a better fit in some cultures than others, and undoubtedly, I'm sure there are some players that thrive on having a chip on their shoulder and proving somebody else wrong. Doesn't mean everybody else, you know, works in that, and just coming to understand what works for you is a really important distinction.
Yeah. And it's true for me as a young executive, like I need the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really want a boss who's like, you don't have any of this experience, prove me wrong. Like that's not motivating to me.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, this has been a great conversation. Yeah, I'll always enjoy our conversations, and exciting to hear the way you're embracing the importance of culture and what you're doing to try to figure out. And granted, it's a learning curve and stuff that you'll continue to learn, but seeing how you understand just how important that is and the things you're doing to try to architect that um, is really fascinating. And I look forward to continuing to compare notes on what I've learned and what you're learning, and see how we can help each other. So thank you so much for joining us on Culture Architects.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah. We'll talk about this anytime. So thanks for having me on.
You bet.